The story begins on a bitterly cold January morning in 1953, a day that was meant to mark a smooth transition of power, a moment of national unity, and the quiet dignity of democracy at work. The Capitol was alive with the hum of anticipation. Crowds gathered along Pennsylvania Avenue, children perched on shoulders, newspapers rustling in the wind, and flags snapping crisply against the gray sky. For most Americans, the inauguration of a new president is a ceremonial pageant, a symbol of stability, and the promise of fresh leadership. But behind the public spectacle, an invisible tension was simmering, one that would soon boil over into a quiet scandal, a breach of protocol, and a story that few remember today. The day General Dwight D. Eisenhower refused to enter Harry Truman's White House. To understand why this moment was so shocking, we have to step back a few years. World War II had ended, leaving the United States in a position of unprecedented global power. Harry Truman, the man who had assumed the presidency after Franklin D. Roosevelt's sudden death, had faced some of the most difficult decisions in modern history. The decision to drop the atomic bomb, the transition from war to peace, the forging of the United Nations, and the early rumblings of the Cold War were all part of Truman's tumultuous tenure. Despite his massive responsibilities and a reputation for blunt honesty, Truman was often underestimated and disliked by some members of the military and political elite, who found his style grating, his decisiveness, sometimes impulsive, and his criticism of military leaders, sharp. Eisenhower, by contrast, was a man shaped by the battlefields of Europe. Supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, he had overseen the liberation of Nazi-occupied France and orchestrated the invasion of Normandy, one of the most complex military operations in history. Known for his calm demeanor, strategic brilliance, and personal charm, Ike had become a national hero. Millions of Americans trusted him implicitly, not just as a soldier, but as a symbol of competence, courage, and dignity. By 1952, as the Korean War dragged on and domestic politics grew increasingly tense, Eisenhower was the inevitable Republican candidate for president. His popularity was immense, and his campaign focused on bringing honesty, order, and a steady hand back to the White House. The relationship between Truman and Eisenhower, however, was complicated. During the war, Eisenhower had often clashed with Truman over strategy and personnel decisions. Truman, as vice president and then president, was not shy about asserting his authority over military leaders, and Eisenhower had a deep sense of pride and personal integrity. While the press often painted Eisenhower as genial and easygoing, those who knew him well understood that he had limits, boundaries that he would not cross, even for the sake of appearances. The tension between these two men was quietly building for years, a mix of personality, principle, and the heavy weight of history. As the 1952 election drew to a close, Truman knew he would not be returning to the White House. There was speculation about the customary meeting between outgoing and incoming presidents, a tradition meant to signal continuity, respect, and unity. But behind the ceremonial niceties lay a subtle, bitter undercurrent. Reports from insiders hinted at Truman's irritation with Eisenhower's criticisms of his administration, particularly regarding the handling of the Korean War. Truman had felt his authority challenged, his decisions questioned, and his efforts to leave a legacy respected, suddenly undercut by the man who was about to succeed him. For Eisenhower, the wariness ran in the opposite direction. He had no desire to be publicly humiliated, and he wanted to assert that the new era of leadership would be marked not by petty rivalries, but by dignity and principle. Then came the day of the inauguration. Eisenhower had arrived in Washington with all the pomp and expectation befitting a national hero. The city was alive with color, banners, and music. The crowds cheered as motorcades moved through the streets, reporters scribbled furiously, and cameras captured every smile and wave. But when the moment came for Eisenhower to enter the White House, a decision that seemed routine to most Americans, he made a choice that shocked everyone. He would not cross Truman's threshold. He would refuse to enter the residence, the very symbol of executive power, under the outgoing president. It was more than a simple snub. To the public, it seemed a small, almost trivial action. But within the walls of Washington power and the corridors of history, it was a statement. Eisenhower was signaling, quietly but unmistakably that he would not allow himself to be belittled, that he would not participate in a ritual that felt compromised by personal animosity, and that he would assert his own authority from the very beginning. What exactly transpired in those tense hours, and why Eisenhower felt compelled to take such an unusual step, would reveal much about the personalities, politics, and hidden conflicts of the era. The refusal was not born of petty spite alone. Historians suggest a combination of personal pride, long-standing irritation with Truman's behavior, and an unspoken message to the nation. The new president would lead with independence, with strength, and on his own terms. Eisenhower understood the optics, the symbolism, and the power of restraint. By choosing not to enter the White House, he made a subtle yet unforgettable statement about authority, respect, and the sometimes fragile civility that underpins even the most established traditions of American governance. In the hours before the ceremony, White House staffers whispered in corridors, aides shuffled nervously, and journalists speculated, was this an accident, a miscommunication, or a deliberate affront? The answer was clear to those who knew Eisenhower well. It was deliberate. He had weighed the consequences, understood the historical significance, and decided that the act of refusal was necessary, a quiet stand that would reverberate through history, a story that would be retold for generations, as a curious and dramatic moment in the otherwise orderly transfer of power. As the nation celebrated the swearing-in of a new president, the drama behind closed doors unfolded quietly, largely unnoticed by the cheering crowds. Eisenhower's refusal became an invisible statement, a tension held in the pauses of conversation, the stiffness of official photos, and the careful diplomacy of aides and secretaries. And while the inauguration itself proceeded without incident, the invisible scar of that moment lingered, a reminder that behind every public display of unity, there are often private rivalries, hidden frustrations, and the human complexity of the men who hold the highest office in the land. This story is not just about a snub, it is about pride, principle, and the intricate dance of power in a democracy. It is about the collision of two extraordinary lives, a president shaped by sudden responsibility and relentless scrutiny, and a general shaped by war, discipline, and an unyielding sense of honor. The scene is set, the players are in place, and the events that followed would reveal much more than a simple breach of protocol. The question remained, why did Eisenhower refuse, and what did it say about the man, the office, and the turbulent politics of the early 1950 seconds? And that question leads us to the heart of the story, the moment where personal pride intersects with history, where a seemingly small decision becomes a defining chapter in the tale of two remarkable Americans. The inauguration insult, as it would later be remembered, was more than a headline. It was a window into the delicate balance of respect, authority, and principle that defines leadership at the highest level. The answers lie ahead, in the hidden details, the fascinating anecdotes, and the lesser-known facts that reveal why one of the most revered figures in American history refused a seemingly simple, symbolic gesture, and in doing so, left an indelible mark on the story of American power. The story picks up in the immediate aftermath of Eisenhower's refusal, and it's here that the human drama truly begins to unfold. While the public cheered for the new president, inside the halls of power, tension crackled like static electricity. White House aides were bewildered, unsure how to interpret Eisenhower's actions. Was this a diplomatic misstep, a subtle insult, or a signal of the new president's independence? To most Americans, it was invisible, lost in the pomp of the parade and the sound of marching bands. But for those who understood the personalities involved, it was a shock and a glimpse into the complicated relationship between Truman and Eisenhower. Truman, despite his reputation as blunt and forthright, was a man deeply sensitive to protocol and respect. Though history often remembers him for the big, sweeping decisions, the atomic bomb, the Marshall Plan, the recognition of Israel, he was acutely aware of the small, symbolic gestures that underscored authority. To him, the act of welcoming his successor into the White House was more than a courtesy. It was a ritual that affirmed the peaceful transfer of power and reflected the dignity of the office he held. Eisenhower's refusal, though quiet, struck at something Truman valued deeply: recognition and respect. Interestingly, Historians point out that the seeds of this tension had been planted years earlier. During World War II, Eisenhower had often disagreed with Truman's decisions about military personnel and strategy. While their public interactions were professional, the private exchanges could be prickly. Truman was known for his impatience with generals who questioned his authority, and Eisenhower, for his part, had a strong sense of personal honor. It wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a collision of two men who understood power differently, two men shaped by extraordinary circumstances, each unwilling to yield ground unnecessarily. What makes this episode even more fascinating are the behind-the-scenes details. On the morning of the inauguration, Eisenhower's aides had prepared a schedule, anticipating the customary courtesy visit. The White House had arranged for him to be greeted, escorted through the historic rooms, and offered a brief opportunity to meet with Truman privately. Yet Eisenhower, aware of the symbolic weight, made the decision not to enter at all. According to sources, he and his inner circle debated the optics of walking in under Truman's roof, weighing whether it might be interpreted as deference, or worse, a tacit acknowledgement of past disagreements. The decision, ultimately, was deliberate, calculated, and carried the quiet force of a man determined to assert his independence. Even more striking is how Eisenhower handled the situation publicly. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic protest. In fact, newspapers reported little about the refusal at the time, and many Americans never knew it had happened. Eisenhower simply conducted himself with calm dignity, attending the inaugural ceremonies, delivering his speech, and beginning his term without fanfare or unnecessary conflict. But the subtle act spoke volumes to insiders and historians alike. It was a message about boundaries, personal respect, and the assertion of authority, without overt confrontation. In many ways, it was Eisenhower's style of leadership distilled into a single, quiet gesture. Another layer to this story involves the role of Truman's staff. The aides, caught between the former president's expectations and the incoming president's choices, scrambled to maintain decorum. They understood the significance of the moment, and they knew that any misstep could be magnified in the press or interpreted as a breach of tradition. Some accounts describe tense meetings in the early hours of the day, as aides whispered in corridors, debated the wording of press releases, and sought to smooth over what could have become a diplomatic embarrassment. Yet, Eisenhower's decision was firm. He would not be drawn into a confrontation, nor would he participate in a ritual that felt compromised by personal history. Adding further intrigue, several historians have suggested that Eisenhower's choice was also influenced by his concern over public perception. He was acutely aware that any sign of weakness or excessive deference could be used against him politically. By maintaining a deliberate distance, he presented an image of strength and independence, signaling that while he respected the office, he would lead on his own terms. In a subtle but powerful way, the refusal became a masterstroke of political communication, conveying authority without a single word, leaving both allies and rivals to interpret the message. Then, there is the human element, the private tension that rarely makes it into the history books. Friends and aides later recalled Truman's frustration, describing moments of sharp, private irritation. Eisenhower, on the other hand, remained composed, guided by a deep sense of self-discipline that had been honed on the battlefields of Europe. It is fascinating to imagine the two men, one in the White House, the other waiting outside, each aware of the stakes, each understanding the silent drama unfolding. It is in these small, human moments that history often reveals its most compelling truths, the quiet power struggles, the personal pride, and the unspoken codes of honor that shape the course of events. In the days that followed, the story took on a life of its own. Political commentators speculated, staffers whispered, and historians began to piece together the chain of events. Some argued that Eisenhower's refusal was a deliberate rebuke, a symbolic assertion of moral high ground. Others suggested it was simply a personal matter, a way for a proud man to maintain dignity in the face of a difficult relationship. The truth is likely a mixture of both, a combination of personal pride, historical context, and strategic foresight that created a moment of quiet yet enduring drama. What makes this story so compelling is how it encapsulates the intersection of personality, politics, and history. It is easy to view presidential transitions as smooth, ceremonial processes, but the reality is far more complex. The men who occupy the Oval Office are not simply administrators. They are human beings with egos, loyalties, grudges, and principles. Eisenhower's refusal was a reminder that even in the structured world of Washington, personal dynamics can shape history, influence perception, and leave an imprint on the national story. This is also a story about timing and symbolism. By choosing that specific moment, the day of the inauguration, Eisenhower transformed a private decision into a historically resonant act. It was a calculated move that preserved his dignity while quietly signaling the end of one era and the beginning of another. The refusal to enter the White House was more than protocol. It was a message to Truman, to the nation, and to history itself. Dwight Eisenhower would lead as he believed best, guided by principle and unshaken by past grievances. Yet, despite the tension, both men carried on with their responsibilities. Truman departed, Eisenhower assumed the presidency, and the machinery of government continued its work. The public saw only the ceremonial smiles, the inaugural address, and the pomp of democracy. But behind that facade, a story of subtle defiance and personal assertion played out. A story that reminds us that history is shaped not only by speeches and legislation, but by the human choices, sometimes quiet, sometimes dramatic, that define character and leadership. In exploring this moment, we also glimpse the fragile nature of tradition. In the United States, the peaceful transfer of power is a cornerstone of democracy, a ritual designed to reinforce continuity and stability. Yet even within this structured process, individual actions, informed by personality and principle, can alter perception and leave lasting marks. Eisenhower's refusal is an example of how a single, deliberate decision executed without fanfare can ripple through history, influencing how leaders are remembered and how moments of power are understood. As the country looked forward to Eisenhower's presidency, the story of the inauguration insult quietly endured in the background, whispered among insiders, and preserved in memoirs, letters, and historical records. It became a fascinating footnote, a reminder that even in moments of national unity, the personal remains profoundly influential. And while the world celebrated the hero-turned-president, the quiet drama of that morning served as a subtle reminder. Leadership is as much about principle and personal integrity as it is about policies and politics. The narrative deepens as we consider the broader implications. Eisenhower's approach set a tone for his administration. Measured, deliberate, and independent, he demonstrated that leadership could be firm without being confrontational, assertive without being openly aggressive. The refusal to enter the White House was an early lesson in statesmanship, one that spoke volumes about the kind of president he intended to be. In the next part, we will uncover the climax of this story, the private interactions, the reactions, and the consequences of that fateful decision. We'll explore how this quiet act of defiance reverberated through the Truman administration, shaped Eisenhower's early presidency, and left a lasting imprint on the traditions and expectations of American political life. The moment was small in action but monumental in meaning, a lesson in power, pride, and the subtle art of leadership that few would forget. The morning sun glinted off the White House portico, casting long shadows across the frosted lawns, as Washington, D. carried on in its customary mixture of ceremony and quiet chaos. On the surface, the day of the inauguration was proceeding as planned. Dignitaries were arriving, cameras clicked, and the nation's attention was fixed on the grand swearing-in. Yet behind the official smiles and well-rehearsed waves, the tension between Truman and Eisenhower lingered like a silent undertone, shaping the first hours of a new presidency in ways that most Americans would never see. Inside the White House, Truman's frustration simmered. He had watched from the threshold, aides whispering hurried explanations and reassurances, while the outgoing president processed the subtle, unspoken affront. To Truman, the refusal to enter was more than a breach of etiquette, it was a deeply personal slight. He had spent the last 4 years navigating crises of unprecedented magnitude, guiding the world through the aftermath of a global war, confronting the rise of the Soviet Union, and managing the painful stalemate of the Korean conflict. Respect, in his mind, was not merely ceremonial, it was a currency that validated the immense burdens he had carried. And yet, in this single, quiet gesture, Eisenhower seemed to withhold that acknowledgement, asserting an independence that Truman could neither ignore nor easily reconcile. Eisenhower, meanwhile, remained outside, calm and measured, fully aware of the stakes. His choice was neither impulsive nor petty. It was deliberate, rooted in a deep sense of personal integrity and the experience of a lifetime spent in command. Eisenhower understood the subtle power of restraint, how a single, unspoken action could communicate firmness, dignity, and authority without a single public word. To the public, his demeanor was the picture of decorum. To insiders, it was a calculated statement. He would not be diminished, nor would he participate in a ritual that conflicted with his principles. The weeks following the inauguration added further layers to the story. In private meetings with aides, Eisenhower reflected on the delicate balance between personal pride and national expectation. He knew that leadership required both strength and diplomacy, that every action carried symbolic weight, and that early missteps could set the tone for an entire administration. His refusal to enter the White House was emblematic of a larger approach: measured decisiveness, careful management of optics, and the ability to assert authority without overt confrontation. Historians note that this quiet act helped define the early perception of his presidency, signaling that Eisenhower's leadership would be guided by principle rather than deference to precedent or personality. Truman, for his part, eventually channeled his irritation into the work of transition. Publicly, he maintained the veneer of composure expected of a president. Privately, however, the moment lingered. Correspondence and memoirs reveal a mix of bemusement and lingering frustration as Truman tried to reconcile his expectations with Eisenhower's decision. This human dimension, the collision of pride, principle, and personal history, offers a rare glimpse into the emotional undercurrents that shape leadership at the highest level. Even in the structured, ceremonial world of presidential transitions, these personal dynamics matter profoundly. As the months unfolded, the significance of the refusal became clearer. Eisenhower's presidency began with a quiet assertion of authority, a demonstration that the new leader would govern according to his own principles. The inauguration insult, subtle though it was, sent a clear message to the political establishment: respect must be earned, and leadership is as much about personal integrity as it is about policy. This early gesture would influence the tone of Eisenhower's administration, fostering an image of independence, competence, and measured judgment. It would also quietly remind the nation that the transfer of power, while ceremonial, is never immune to the complexities of human relationships. Interestingly, the story of this refusal did not remain entirely hidden. A few reporters and aides eventually chronicled the event, and historians piecing together the narrative were struck by its implications. It was a case study in the subtle arts of leadership, diplomacy, and strategic communication. By refusing a simple, symbolic gesture, Eisenhower communicated volumes about his character, his principles, and the kind of presidency he intended to run. It was a reminder that sometimes the most enduring statements are made not with speeches or proclamations, but with small, deliberate acts that resonate across time. The ripple effects extended beyond the immediate players. Future administrations would witness the delicate balance of protocol and personal assertion, understanding that the ceremony of power carries meaning beyond optics. Eisenhower's quiet defiance demonstrated that even in the most structured traditions, individual agency matters. It illustrated that leadership involves not only public action but also the careful calibration of personal dignity, perception, and principle. Reflecting on the moment, one sees a fascinating interplay of personalities. Truman, shaped by sudden responsibility and the relentless pressure of global crises, valued recognition and the affirmation of authority. Eisenhower, forged in the crucible of war and discipline, valued principle and the assertion of independence. Their collision, brief and largely invisible to the public, reveals how deeply human the exercise of power truly is, guided not only by policy and procedure, but by pride, temperament, and personal code. Ultimately, the refusal to enter the White House was a defining moment for both men. For Eisenhower, it set the tone for his presidency: calm, deliberate, principled, and independent. For Truman, it was a reminder that even in victory or transition, human relationships are complex, fraught with emotion, and capable of leaving lasting impressions. The story endures not as a scandal, but as a testament to the subtle, often invisible forces that shape history. And so, the inauguration insult became more than a historical footnote. It was a lesson in leadership, a study of human dignity, and a vivid reminder that in the corridors of power, the smallest gestures can echo the loudest. History remembers the swearing in, the speeches, and the parades, but those who look closer see the quiet drama that played out behind the scenes, a story of principle, pride, and the remarkable intersection of two extraordinary lives. At the very moment, one man passed the torch to another. In the end, the story of why Eisenhower refused to enter Truman's White House is a window into the human side of history, the private dynamics that influence public outcomes, and the subtle, powerful ways in which personal integrity can define a presidency. It reminds us that leadership is not only about the decisions made in public, but about the choices made quietly, deliberately, and with unwavering attention to principle. And in that quiet refusal, Eisenhower spoke louder than any speech ever could, leaving a legacy of dignity, independence, and a nuanced understanding of what it truly means to hold the highest office in the land. History may remember the pageantry, the flags, and the crowds, but those who study the past closely will always recall the silent statement made on that cold January day, a single act that captured the essence of character, the weight of principle, and the enduring drama of power in America. This was not just an inauguration, it was a lesson, a warning, and, above all, a story of respect, pride, and the quiet power of a man determined to lead on his own terms.